Greetings and a journey back through time. Hey there, friend. Before we begin untangling one of the most haunting and astonishing crime sagas from California's shadowy judicial history, let me prepare you for an emotional ride unlike any other. Today, let me be your companion and guide as we step out of the everyday hustle, slow our breath, and push the invisible door of time wide open, traveling back a full 6 decades to a world that feels alien, yet eerily familiar. Picture it. America in the early 1960s. Kennedy's face is on every television. Rock and roll is the talk of the teens, but the older folks still clutch their values from the 1950s, believing every white picket fence could keep darkness at bay. California is a land of promise and contradiction, sunshine flooding Main Street, but storm clouds gathering behind the manicured hedges of suburbia. There's fear in the air, as the country holds its breath in the throes of change. From civil rights protests to shifting family roles and growing mistrust of institutions once considered bulletproof. Within this dynamic backdrop, there's a forgotten house on a winding street, a place where gentle winds carry secrets and the laughter of children once drifted through the curtains. It's there, our focus sharpens on a young woman, a mother-to-be, fragile yet determined, who stands at the threshold of her future, and the yawning chasm of an event that will rip the American dream wide open. Why revisit this? Because in peeling away the layers of a long-buried tragedy, we don't just learn about the past, we see the patterns that keep repeating even now. This is not just a story about a single act of violence or even a single family, it's a kaleidoscope of lost innocence, the fallout from society's silence, and the ways individuals try, and sometimes fail, to escape their own histories. So settle in. Your curiosity, your empathy, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths are your ticket. Together we'll relive a courtroom drama that rocked California's conscience, but more importantly, we'll try to understand what drives an ordinary person to the very edge. The people whose shadows cross these pages are real. They struggled, suffered, and shaped a legacy that still ripples outward. Are you ready to walk with me into the echoes of a case that begs to be retold, for the sake of those still searching for meaning in its aftermath? Let's step through that doorway, together. Destiny unfolds at a California courtroom, 1964. The faded photograph of the Sacramento County Courthouse tells you little of the drama that once shook its marbled halls. May 22, 1964, a day that slipped into local legend. Picture it, the glare of television cameras, the feverish scratch of reporters' pens, and every pew packed with townsfolk hungry for answers, for gossip, or perhaps, deep down, for a sense of justice being done. At the center, barely 18, soft-faced and visibly pregnant, stood Dorothy Ann Miller, an image of innocence marred by the weight of the accusations leveled against her. Dorothy's world had already been scorched by hardship before she ever crossed the courtroom threshold. She was no stranger to loss or struggle, and as she stood before the judge, she embodied both vulnerability and an astonishing inner fire. The charge against her was as grave as it gets: the murder of her husband, John Carter. What made the story explode in the public's imagination wasn't just the violence itself, but the swirling rumors of abuse, addiction, and desperate survival that percolated beneath the prim, unruffled surface of 1960s middle-class America. There she was, gripping the rail with trembling hands while the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer. According to their account, Dorothy had waited, gun in hand, for her husband's back to turn as he prepared to leave the house forever. Bang! In a matter of seconds, a marriage ended with a fatal shot, and a future fractured not just for Dorothy, but for her unborn child and the community watching breathlessly. But then the tables turned. The defense meticulously unraveled the story, revealing a marriage steeped in cycles of alcohol-fueled violence. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors recalling late-night screaming, friends testifying to blackened eyes, a police record punctuated by withdrawal and fear. What at first had looked like a cold-blooded crime now shimmered with shades of gray. Dorothy, through choked sobs, described long years of terror and control, how her dreams of a peaceful life had curdled into relentless anxiety. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Dorothy shared that she didn't act out of hatred, but in a desperate bid to save herself and her unborn child. The jury, tough, pragmatic, and not easily swayed by tears, leaned in closer, something in their collective demeanor softening as the layers of her ordeal came into focus. Was she a criminal, or a casualty of an inescapable tragedy? The verdict? Not guilty. On that cloudless May day, Dorothy was acquitted, her relief mingling with an undeniable sense of loss that rippled through the packed courtroom. But the story refused to end there. As the doors swung open and Dorothy stepped out, free but forever changed, those who bore witness were left grappling with questions not just about justice, but about mercy, resilience, and the invisible wounds so many carried into the sunlight, hoping, perhaps in vain, for a fresh start. Restless Roots. A life born in Sacramento's hardship. The saga of Dorothy Ann Miller didn't begin in a vacuum. To understand why fate pressed so heavily upon her slender shoulders, we need to wind back the clock to post-war Sacramento, a city simmering with hope and hardship in equal measure. Piecing together her origins means tracing the quiet desperation that sketched shadows across her family's American dream. Dorothy was born in 1946 in a cramped two-bedroom house in North Sacramento, the third child of a blended family. Her mother, Marlene, was a survivor from a previous abusive marriage, carrying emotional and physical scars long before Dorothy entered the world. Marlene's second marriage to Walter Miller was earnest but unstable, weighed down by the constant threat of unemployment and the skyrocketing bills that came with keeping a growing family fed and clothed during lean years. Walter earned his living in the purgatory of the Sacramento dairy plant, pulling double shifts when work was to be had, only to come home hollow-eyed and aching. Despite his efforts, the Miller household scraped by on the edge, winter nights spent wrapped tight under fraying blankets, kitchen cupboards that creaked with emptiness just before payday, and the relentless hush-hush arguments muffled through thin walls. Yet in those early years, hope flickered. Backyard birthdays, the sweet splurge of a real Christmas tree bought on layaway, shared laughter over radio serials, but the American landscape itself was shifting beneath their feet. Racial tension, new waves of migration, and the widening gap between the haves and have-nots set the city on edge. Within their own four walls, the Miller family's grip on stability was tenuous at best. Walter's health soon failed him. Hands that once cradled Dorothy grew shaky with the tremors of a disease no one dared name in those days. The slow unraveling of his body left Marlene not just the sole breadwinner, but the only emotional anchor her children had left. Trips to local charities and church pantries became routine. Marlene juggled housekeeping jobs, her fingers swollen from scrubbing other people's floors, while Dorothy tried to shoulder cares far beyond her years. Scenes from her Girl Scout days, collecting cans from neighbors, shyly urging her friends to donate mittens and old shoes, hinted at childhood interrupted. And yet, there was no denying her resilience. Dorothy learned grit the hard way, patching dresses from flour sacks and rationing out portions so her younger siblings could eat first. When Marlene died suddenly of heart disease in 1961, what scant scaffolding had kept the Millers above water collapsed. Dorothy's father, racked by loss and the end of his ability to earn, slipped fast into drinking and bitterness. The eviction notice was swift. Within weeks, Dorothy and her siblings turned from tenants to wanderers, their few belongings crammed into battered suitcases as they shuffled among distant relatives and faded motels. The American dream, so bright and beguiling on billboards, felt a million miles away for a girl clutching the hands of her bewildered little brothers on a chilly Sacramento dawn. Those restless roots, the poverty, the heartbreak, the constant sense of not belonging or being safe, became the silent engine driving every desperate choice Dorothy was yet to make. Hers was an America of shut doors and thin comfort, of survival at all costs, and wounds that time alone couldn't heal. That haunted legacy would shape not just her fate, but ripple outward across generations, long after the courtroom drama faded from front pages. Misfortune strikes a family rocked by illness and hardship. Just as hope seemed to be flickering in the Miller household, reality threw them a curveball that would upend everything. In the waning glow of the 1950s, the Sacramento sun could do little to brighten the days for Dorothy's family. Walter Miller, Dorothy's father, who had spent years manning the unforgiving machines of the local dairy plant, started to change in ways that no one understood at first. He was only in his 40s when the earliest symptoms crept in: trembling hands, stiffness that made crossing the kitchen seem mountainous, and a shuffling walk that grew slower by the week. The doctor's verdict, when it finally came, was chilling: Parkinson's disease. For working-class families like the Millers, such a diagnosis didn't just mean hardship, it meant devastation. Walter, whose identity had always centered on providing for his family, saw that one assurance slip through his fingers as his skills became unreliable and eventually, entirely unusable. The factory's whistle that once called him faithfully each morning no longer summoned him. Instead, he became a fixture in the living room armchair, watching the world and his place in it shrink alongside his muscle control. With Walter's paycheck gone, the Millers' grip on their fragile existence weakened further. Medical bills piled up on the kitchen counter, each one a silent, heavy presence to match the daily uncertainty. Marlene, already bearing scars from a life that was rarely kind, was forced back out into the world she'd hoped to escape when she remarried. She cleaned houses, took shifts at the diner and accepted odd jobs wherever she could, her hands raw from scrubbing and her spirit nearly as battered as Walter's body. Still, her wages barely stretched far enough. The children, Dorothy included, quickly learned the sting of sacrifice. The midnight worry over utilities being disconnected, the quiet embarrassment of hand-me-downs and delayed dentistry, the awkward way school lunches never seemed to last long enough. Worse still, Walter's encroaching illness twisted not just his body, but his disposition. Frustration and resentment boiled under the surface. Arguments with Marlene became more frequent as he grew bitter over his lost purpose. The home that once echoed with laughter now vibrated with tension. Dorothy, both witness and inadvertent participant, would do her best to soothe siblings, cling to fragments of childhood, and retreat to her books when the shouting started up again. Then, as if the universe wasn't finished with its cruel trial, tragedy struck again. In a single, heart-rending evening in 1961, Marlene collapsed from a massive heart attack, worn down by years of unrelenting stress and silent sacrifice. Dorothy was just 15. Walter, left without his anchor, crumbled fast, now not just physically broken, but emotionally adrift. Within weeks the family lost their home. They packed their lives into dented suitcases and found themselves bouncing from couch to couch, strangers' spare rooms, and gritty motel corners on the underside of Sacramento. The American dream, once painted so bright on post-war billboards, became little more than a bitter punchline for Dorothy and her brothers. Through it all, the Miller children became expert survivors. They picked up newspaper routes, scraped together coins for groceries, and learned how to move quietly, cautiously, so as not to draw the wrong kind of attention. Each night Dorothy would promise herself that no matter how bad things got, she would never give up, that somehow bare-knuckled grit and hope might be enough to carve out a better future. Yet despite her tenacity, the shadows of misfortune would continue to follow her, shaping her choices for years to come. Rushed into marriage. The beginning of a tragic spiral. By age 16, Dorothy was not unlike many young women in her neighborhood, eager for stability, desperate for belonging, and still carrying the wounds of a childhood that seemed to crumble with every passing season. The era was unforgiving for teenage girls with limited means. Without a mother's guiding hand or a secure roof overhead, options felt painfully scarce. Dropping out of high school, Dorothy made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life. She married John Carter, a local laborer just barely out of boyhood himself, a man whose gentle laughter and easy promises felt like a safe harbor from stormy days. At first, the newlyweds clung to each other in their small, rented room, trying to build the semblance of a normal home. There were whispered dreams of white picket fences and better tomorrows. For a fleeting moment, Dorothy allowed herself to believe in happy endings, moments spent window shopping for cribs, jotting down baby names and exchanging hopeful glances at the future. But such fairy tales, especially for those marked by poverty and trauma, often prove heartbreakingly short-lived. No sooner had they welcomed their first child, a bright-eyed son bursting with new hope, than the cracks began to show in their fragile, domestic peace. John, already battered by the pressures of providing for a growing family and haunted by ghosts of his own family history, started coming home later and later, his breath heavy with the smell of cheap whiskey. Their shared warmth curdled into icy silences and mounting tension, punctuated by slammed doors, muffled cries, and the slow, creeping fear Dorothy had hoped she'd left far behind. Arguments escalated. Sometimes the neighbors would hear objects breaking or doors slamming after midnight. The American dream that Dorothy once glimpsed felt further away than ever. She found herself tiptoeing around John's unpredictable moods, terrified of provoking another outburst. Yet, the tangled dance of love and violence was difficult to escape. In a society that rarely sided with battered women, where shame and blame converged, Dorothy often felt hopelessly alone. A few times when the bruises or terror became unbearable, she gathered the strength to call the police, only to later withdraw her complaints, crippled by fear and the weighty expectations of her world. Her isolation grew as friends discreetly distanced themselves, unsure of how to intervene, while the judgmental murmurs among community members only deepened Dorothy's sense of shame and entrapment. Each day became a careful calculation: how to keep the peace, how to protect her son, and, heartbreakingly, how to keep from disappearing entirely beneath the avalanche of sorrow and regret. It was in these long, sorrowful nights and tense mornings that the seeds were sown for a tragedy that would soon shake not only Dorothy's tiny family, but the entire community to its core. A shocking case: the price of one night of rage. On the morning of May 6, 1964, the city of Sacramento woke to a kind of restless quiet, one that only ever settles before the storm of scandal breaks. News didn't travel at light speed the way it does today, but it didn't have to. Whispers started on the front steps of corner stores, spilled over the smoky counters of diners, and wound their way through the checkerboard-patterned kitchens of suburban homes. Something unthinkable had happened in a modest, weather-beaten house on Magnolia Avenue a few hours before sunrise, an event that would soon hold an entire state captive. The night before had been John Carter's birthday. Friends, beer, laughter, a raucous celebration that bled well past midnight. As Dorothy sat alone in their bedroom, she heard the telltale clatter of bottles and the distant echo of old rock and roll. There was nothing unusual about her husband's late-night returns, except perhaps the way fear pooled in her stomach every time she sensed his slow, heavy steps on the porch. That night, though, the tension bristled, a kind of electricity that Dorothy swore she could taste in the air. When John finally came through the door, the house was silent, the party over everywhere except inside his head. Words, sharp with exhaustion and liquor, filled the tiny space between them. Old arguments found new ground, ancient resentment igniting like dry kindling. John, eyes wild, hurled accusations and ultimatums. Divorce, he threatened, while Dorothy, trembling, begged for calm, for mercy, for just a moment of peace. The baby, she should have kept thinking only about the baby. But fear has a way of compressing time, making seconds feel like centuries, stealing all hope of reason or retreat. What happened next would become the focus of legal testimonies, media speculation, and endless small-town gossip. In the haze of panic, Dorothy reached for the rifle. Was it self-defense, a final stand in the face of years of violence, or the product of a split-second decision no one could truly understand unless they had lived inside her skin? The fatal shot rang out, a single deafening punctuation mark at the end of a long, tragic sentence. The police arrived as dawn broke over the city. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the first rays of sunlight. Dorothy, numb and wide-eyed, barely registered the questions barked at her by trembling officers. Neighbors stood with arms crossed, faces pale yet hungry for the story that would soon become their own. In a matter of hours, Dorothy was handcuffed, John lay lifeless in the entryway, and the quiet had shattered for good. The court proceedings that followed were nothing short of theatrical. Sacramento's normally sleepy courthouse was besieged by reporters and curious onlookers desperate for a glimpse of the woman at the center of the tragedy. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, every detail, fact or rumor became fodder for a community eager to assign blame. Whose fault was this? The battered wife's? The violent husband's? Society's? Dorothy's lawyer wove a narrative that both captivated and horrified. He painted Dorothy not as a villain, but as the ultimate victim, a woman cornered by fear, battered by years of abuse, failed by neighbors, friends, and the very institutions supposed to protect her. Every bruise was catalogued, every emergency call repeated for the jury. They heard of John's rages, his drinking, his impossible moods, yet, buried somewhere amid the empathy, there lurked nagging questions. Did Dorothy truly have no choice? Could anything justify a life lost? The prosecution countered with cold efficiency. They depicted Dorothy as calculated, someone who waited for just the right moment to act. They pointed to the lack of defensive wounds, her measured answers to police, the way she cradled the weapon before the shot. They asked if endurance justified ending a life. They asked if pain always leads to violence. For days the trial seesawed, each side drawing portraits so vivid and contradictory that even seasoned courthouse regulars found themselves pulled in opposite directions. The gallery, packed to bursting, gasped at emotional testimony. They wept when Dorothy spoke of hiding bruises with powder and long sleeves. They stared, riveted, as forensic experts recounted the angle of the bullet and the time of death. No one left unchanged. Outside, the city rumbled with debates that went well beyond the courthouse walls. Churches held prayer circles. Women's groups rallied for Dorothy. framing her as a symbol of battered wives too long ignored. Men's clubs whispered about the breakdown of family order, the dangers of lost authority. The growing media spectacle only raised the stakes. But inside the courtroom, despite the spectacle, the core question held steady. Was Dorothy's act a cry for help, or a calculated crime? Before the jury deliberated, Dorothy made her own appeal. Her words, raw and shaking, lingered long after she finished speaking. "I only ever wanted to be safe, just once. I was so tired of being afraid." After tense deliberation, the verdict finally came. Not guilty. Some cheered, others mourned. Dorothy was free. Not truly, not in the ways that mattered, but at least in the eyes of the law. John's parents left the courthouse, faces shuttered and mouths set in anger. Dorothy clung to her stomach, the future of her unborn child uncertain, and yet something close to hope flickered for the first time in years. The city soon returned to its regular rhythms, but for Dorothy and those touched by the case, nothing would ever be the same. That night of furious choices became both a moment of liberation and the opening act of a generational tragedy. Beyond the ruling, one lesson echoed clear. In the fraught silence of abuse and desperation, sometimes it is the act of breaking that is most unforgettable of all. The real face. Behind the acquittal. When the wooden doors of the courthouse swung open and Dorothy Ann Miller was ushered into the blinding light of Sacramento's late spring sun, she could have, at a glance, looked like any other woman finally set free from the teeth of fate. Yet beneath the surface of a legal victory lurked the gnawing agony of a life forever divided into a before and an after. In the weeks that followed the not guilty verdict, Dorothy's name faded from headlines but not from whispered conversation. The town carried many kinds of judgment, sympathy from battered women who recognized themselves in her story, resentment from those who saw justice as denied, and most pervasive of all, a subtle unease, a question lingering in every look and half-concealed glance. What does a person become after surviving the unimaginable? At first Dorothy clung to her children, desperate to carve a sanctuary out of the remnants of her shattered family. She enrolled in a job training program run by a nearby church, showing up early in borrowed clothes, hunched with anxiety, apologizing for her nervousness. The other women eyed her with a mix of awe and pity. Some reached out, most kept their distance, unsure where empathy ended and caution began. Dorothy, for her part, wore a mask of determined cheer, but in her eyes danced the wild, unsettled look of someone perpetually scanning for threats that others could not see. She rented a cramped apartment on the city's rougher edge, a world away from the promise of California sunshine, broken blinds, the sounds of sirens at dusk, and groceries always one paycheck from running out. The welfare checks barely covered rent, and Dorothy found herself bargaining at thrift stores, dodging landlords at the end of each month, and pawning family mementos just to keep the lights on. Her time in court had left her infamous enough that most employers wouldn't risk hiring the woman from the newspapers. Only the lowest-skilled, hardest jobs offered her a grudging entry, and even then, rumors trailed her like storm clouds. Worse than poverty, perhaps, was isolation. The old social network Dorothy once relied on, a handful of childhood friends and distant relations, had shrunk as if her presence were contagious, a harbinger of bad luck or worse. Women she once confided in at the church social now ducked their heads in the grocery aisle. The women's groups who campaigned for battered wives offered theoretical support, but the practical realities of ongoing stigma made integration into their circles painfully difficult. Dorothy's psychological wounds, more subtle than her bruises, began to fester. Some nights when the children were asleep, she would find herself sitting at the kitchen table, elbows on worn formica, sorting through court paperwork by the light of a single bulb. She'd trace her attorney's reassuring words with a trembling finger. "You are not guilty." Yet that verdict, while a shield against prison, did nothing to erase the nightmares or the intrusive memories that replayed like a needle skipping on a broken record. On wind-blown afternoons, she'd startle at the bang of a door or the echo of raised voices from the apartment next door. The post-traumatic shadow clung to her, and despite repeated half-hearted promises to move on, she found herself unable to outrun her past. The community's children were mirrors of their parents. At school, Dorothy's eldest was shunned, jeered as the murder kid. The teachers, unsure how to approach the broken family, sometimes gave the benefit of the doubt, sometimes not. Notes home rarely celebrated progress. They pointed out bruises, lateness, withdrawn behavior. After too many unexplained absences, social workers appeared at Dorothy's door, their faces well-meaning but always lined with suspicion. Dorothy did her best, packed lunches, whispered stories at bedtime, but the relentless grind wore her down, eroding the patience and gentleness she so desperately wanted to preserve for her kids. The men who circled Dorothy in the years after the trial seemed to sense her vulnerability, a magnet for those with wounds and tempers of their own. Some offered companionship. More often, they brought further turmoil. Within a few years, Dorothy had cycled through several relationships, each briefer, more tempestuous than the last. New partners came and went, a parade of broken dreams and mutual bruising. Substance abuse, already a hidden undercurrent, soon became an explicit part of Dorothy's struggle. A glass of cheap wine after the kids had gone to bed turned to two, then a bottle, then, some nights, nothing but numbness. Those who visited Dorothy's apartment during this period sometimes found her listless, lost in the folds of a faded armchair, traces of makeup from a forgotten outing lining her cheeks. The television blared game shows or late-night drama, filling the air with voices that neither accused nor consoled. On particularly dark nights, Dorothy would phone her attorney's office just to hear a calm, familiar voice, a way to remind herself she had once survived far worse, even if survival no longer felt like victory. Neighbors grew wary of the shouting that sometimes spilled from behind Dorothy's door. Drawn at first by curiosity and then by worry, some called the police. The officers recognized Dorothy's name instantly and approached with a practiced mixture of caution and resignation. When asked about the noise, Dorothy explained away the fights as stress, as frustration over bills and broken dreams. The pattern repeated, police reports filed, children questioned, promises to do better, reluctant forgiveness, and then, inevitably, another late-night scene. For years, Dorothy struggled with the push and pull of wanting to heal and the gravitational force of old habits. The trauma, the loneliness, the sense of otherness that tinged every room she entered. Her children, each processing the family's infamy in their own wounded way, mirrored her struggles. The home she fought so fiercely to protect began to fracture in new ways, her children's trust eroding in the acid rain of conflict, addiction, and emotional neglect. Service agencies did their best, but often fell short. Dorothy's family became another file, another cautionary tale. Yet, even at her lowest, Dorothy occasionally managed to spark flashes of the fierce, protective love that had propelled her through the worst of her former life. On rare, bright weekends, she took the children to parks or down to the river, telling stories designed to shield them as much as she could from her own despair. Sometimes, under the filtered sunlight of tall sycamores, Dorothy almost believed in the possibility of forgiveness, from herself, from her children, from a world that had already judged her once and was not eager to grant reprieve. The reality behind the courtroom snapshot, Dorothy victorious, acquitted, shoulders squared, was always more complex. Like so many survivors, Dorothy wasn't granted a true new beginning. The verdict was an escape from one prison, but its bars simply changed form. Poverty, suspicion, loneliness, and the endless labor of trying and often failing to build something livable from ruin. Sacramento, for its part, mostly moved on. A new scandal would soon replace Dorothy's case in the local imagination, but for those who lived in her shadow, her children most of all, the aftershocks rolled on, subtle yet seismic, reshaping lives and legacies in ways the jury could never have anticipated. And Dorothy herself, for all her faults and frailty, remains a testament to the haunting persistence of past wounds and the bittersweet cost of surviving them. A continuum of tragedy, signs of psychological fracture. The shadow cast by Dorothy's acquittal did not simply stay confined within her apartment or the cold, regimented corridors of the courthouse. Instead, it seeped, oozing through narrow hallways, saturating memories and widening cracks within the fragile family she struggled to hold together. If the trial had merely offered a temporary liberation from the law, what followed was its own sort of sentence, a relentless, invisible unraveling that illuminated the devastating psychological toll exacted upon both Dorothy and her children. Dorothy, once capable of mettle and composure, even under the weight of public scorn, began to show unmistakable signs that something within her was unsettled for good. Those first years after the verdict, at times, she would be nearly catatonic for days, only to whirl up suddenly with frantic bursts of energy, cleaning obsessively, rearranging small belongings, making elaborate plans for the future she never quite believed in. At other times, nights stretched out in bitter solitude. Dorothy drank to silence the racing thoughts, her fingers always trembling as she poured another glass of cheap wine. The neighbors often heard muffled sobbing or the creak of her footsteps pacing in the early hours. She became haunted by a sense of imminent threat that never went away, mistrusting even the rare gestures of kindness from her remaining friends or fleeting new acquaintances. Each attempt at stability, romantic, domestic, or financial, ended up amplifying the chaos. Dorothy, desperate for comfort and normalcy, moved quickly into new relationships. 3 additional marriages followed her acquittal. Each hopeful beginning was undermined by Dorothy's persistent emotional volatility, the scars of trauma manifesting in sudden rage, jealousy, or an ache for affection impossible to satisfy. These new spouses, often themselves damaged or drawn in by Dorothy's vulnerability, either turned abusive or fled the growing emotional turbulence. The cycle repeated with relentless precision: hope, disappointment, conflict, collapse. Home life, meant to be a sanctuary, was instead ground for confusion and fear. The children, hardened by years of instability, routinely witnessed arguments, emotional outbursts, and sometimes violence. Dorothy oscillated between overbearing protectiveness and utter detachment. On good days, she baked for them, pressed their hair, and whispered that love was the only thing they had left. On bad days, she was prone to fits of fury, dragging her oldest daughter from the bed in a jealous rage, or hurling accusations of betrayal with no clear cause. The children walked on eggshells, internalizing the reality that their mother, once a figure of resilience, was equally capable of being their tormentor. It was in the language of daily life, the missed meals, unwashed clothing, and piles of unpaid bills, that the fracture lines in the family showed. Some of Dorothy's children attempted to save themselves by escaping altogether, sneaking out through bedroom windows and catching city buses to distant relatives who regarded them as burdensome. Others, less lucky or more loyal, remained behind, bearing the brunt of her unpredictable moods, or taking on parental responsibilities themselves. The older children often shielded their younger siblings from harm, taking blows meant for others, lying to social workers, and inventing stories that kept authorities from digging deeper. Their school performance deteriorated, with teachers describing them as withdrawn, anxious, or sometimes disturbingly aggressive. Community support, never robust to begin with, all but dried up. The notoriety of Dorothy's case marked the family as outcasts. Mothers in nearby apartments pulled their children indoors when the Miller kids passed by. The local church Dorothy once attended now eyed her family with suspicion. Offers of help became rare, often laced with judgment and condescension. Government caseworkers made periodic obligatory visits, jotting down notes as the children presented rehearsed narratives, always careful to mask the extent of household dysfunction. Over time, Dorothy's psychological decline became more pronounced. She spoke to unseen presences, referenced threats that never existed, and increasingly isolated herself from the world outside. She lost jobs one after another due to sudden absences or emotional outbursts on the clock. Poverty followed in lockstep. The family ate in unpredictable rhythms, lived without heat or reliable electricity, and moved from one grimy efficiency apartment to another. Sometimes Dorothy vanished for days at a time, leaving her oldest children in charge. On her return, she offered up meager gifts, promises of departure to a new city, a better life always somewhere on the horizon, but never quite within reach. Despite mounting evidence of dysfunction, intervention failed again and again. Systemic breakdowns allowed the cycle to fester. Overworked child protection agents dismissed bruises as the cost of hard lives, or made judgments colored by prejudice and resources stretched too thin. Where immediate peril was not easy to prove, cases languished without action. The impact on the Miller children was insidious and cumulative. They absorbed their environment's traumas viscerally, developing coping mechanisms that range from deliberate invisibility to wild, uncontrollable anger. Some of the younger children became unusually silent, hiding under beds during arguments, flinching at sudden movements or loud noises. A few tried to placate Dorothy with perfect grades or chores meticulously done in hopes she might grant approval or, at the very least, leave them be. Others rebelled openly, skipping school, scrawling graffiti, or running with delinquent peers who offered camaraderie where their home lives had only pain and suspicion. The home was a cauldron of secrets. Even when aid agencies occasionally left donated clothes or food boxes, Dorothy saw these gestures less as compassion and more as evidence of scrutiny, from the outside world, the government, and judgmental neighbors. Her paranoia bred new dysfunctions, spying on her children, setting traps to catch them in perceived betrayals, or lashing out if she thought their loyalty to her had faltered in the slightest. The children lived with the sense that in their family, love and violence were two sides of the same coin. Signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, became stark over the years. Dorothy suffered nightmares so vivid she would scream herself awake, sometimes waking her kids with pleading apologies, sometimes with terrifying threats. The children, too, began to display dissociative behaviors, blank stares in class, self-harming in hidden places, or inventing elaborate fantasies to cope with unbearable reality. At various points, several children were evaluated for learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, or suspected neglect, yet the full truth of their trauma never surfaced in a way that provoked meaningful intervention. Dorothy's inability to parent effectively became a dark family joke. At family gatherings, which grew rarer over time, relatives whispered about her instability, speculated on her ability to care for so many children, or debated calling the authorities. Still, nothing changed. Those able to kept their distance. Those stuck in orbit around Dorothy compensated however they could, sacrificing their own childhoods in the process. Meanwhile, Dorothy's external relationships continued to spiral. Her marriages dissolved amid bitter accusations, violence, and envy. Her partners cycled through the home, contributing only additional chaos. Some left quietly, battered by the dysfunction, others left with police sirens blazing in the night. Dorothy clung to these men as lifelines, her hope for partnership undimmed by repeated disappointment, but each new attempt at love only deepened the cracks in her psyche and the instability in her household. As the years wore on, Dorothy's substance abuse intensified. What began as a strategy for calming nerves or numbing pain became daily reliance on alcohol, the telltale scent lingering on her breath, even as her children headed to school in the mornings. Prescription pills began to circulate as well, sometimes traded among neighborhood women with similar troubles or purchased under the table from acquaintances willing to look the other way. When the drinking or drugs blurred Dorothy's reality too much, her paranoia manifested as neglect or explosive episodes that left the children desperate for escape. All the while, the external world seemed strikingly indifferent. Reports were made, by teachers, distant family, even the occasional neighbor, but nothing stuck. Authorities arrived, asked questions, and, with a mix of resignation and skepticism, marked the case for monitoring. Even when evidence of physical and emotional harm seemed clear, the machines of bureaucracy, bias, and overwhelmed caseloads spun on. By now, the Miller household was a byword for trouble. It drew whispers in waiting rooms and over backyard fences, but rarely provoked action. Child Protective Services grew so accustomed to the family's dysfunction that reports lost their urgency. As the oldest children reached adolescence, they were either shuffled into foster care, where many ran away or bounced between placements, incarcerated for petty theft, or drawn into their mother's world as accomplices, unwilling, confused, but ultimately compliant in the hope of surviving another day. Dorothy's psychological rifts were, by then, carved into every aspect of her family's life. Even the rare moments of gentleness, a birthday cake, a song before bed, a half-hearted attempt at an ordinary Sunday afternoon, were polluted by the children's knowledge that the next storm could break at any moment. The simple assurances of safety and stability that most children took for granted were absent here. Their home had become a place of permanent vigilance and waiting. Every knock at the door, every ring of the phone, was a possible disaster. Another official check-in, an angry ex-lover, or worse. Family portraits from these years, if any existed, would not show smiles and comfortably posed figures, but rather wary eyes, guarded postures, and palpable distance even as bodies touched. The youngest children born into this maelstrom never knew a time before instability. For them, Dorothy was just a part of the landscape, alternately both jailer and suffocating protector, wounded animal, and unpredictable storm. By the end of 2 decades, the trajectory of Dorothy's psychological decline and its ripple effects was measurable not in headline-making violence but in the quieter devastations. Older children homeless or addicted themselves, histories of repeated hospitalizations, and a weary legacy of distrust for any institution, school, church, social service, or even family itself. In each child you could trace the original wound, a mother marked by trauma she could not soothe, attempting again and again to build a refuge and failing always under the weight of her own fractures. The family's tragedy, unseen by most, was relentless and generational. Dorothy's fleeting moments of self-reflection, hours spent regretting choices, vowing somehow to do better, were never enough to counteract the forces set in motion long before. By the time the outside world was forced to reckon with the depth of suffering inside that battered home, it was already far too late for simple interventions. It was, in every sense, a continuation of unfinished trauma, a slow-motion disaster that would echo for decades in the bodies, minds, and hearts of all who survived it. Wordless wounds of the next generation. The true depth of tragedy is rarely contained within a single life. It spreads, silent and invisible, through the hearts of the next generation. For Dorothy's children, especially her eldest daughter Lisa, the aftermath of violence, poverty, and generational trauma became an inheritance heavier than any material legacy. This legacy lived not in the stories told at family gatherings. Those, after all, were mostly stories no one dared to recount, but hung instead in the unsaid, in the looks exchanged over dinner tables, in the permanent flinch as a voice rose or a door slammed just a bit too hard. Lisa had always been a quiet child, the sort who tried to disappear behind her long bangs at school and shrink herself small enough to avoid her mother's unpredictable temper. People would later remember her as polite, almost painfully so, a little too eager to please. But inside their home, that politeness did nothing to shield her from the emotional crossfire. Dorothy, ravaged by her own pain and paranoia, came to regard Lisa with a combustible blend of suspicion and jealousy. Sometimes, she accused her daughter of plotting against her, of being too friendly with the neighbors, of trying to steal the affection of a current boyfriend. The smallest acts, a missed curfew, a hidden diary, could ignite days of cold-shoulder silence or worse, explosive rage. For Lisa, the world was fraught with danger. She treaded cautiously, always scanning for Dorothy's changing moods, but all the effort in the world could not protect her. That first time Lisa tried to run away, clutching a few belongings in a pillowcase and sneaking out before dawn, she was barely 13. She didn't get far. A neighbor saw her waiting at the bus stop and called the authorities, who dutifully returned her to the only home she'd ever known. There were no follow-up visits, no caseworkers with warm smiles or safe places to land. To the system, Lisa was just another troubled teen from a notorious family, swept quietly back under the rug. After that, Lisa's disappearances became more frequent, never long enough for the outside world to intervene, always just long enough to confirm for herself that there was nowhere safe. The cycles of abuse and reconciliation inside the Miller household followed a predictable rhythm. Tensions would build, Dorothy blaming Lisa for imagined betrayals, the other children growing frightened and compliant. Then, after a particularly volatile confrontation, Dorothy might lock Lisa in her room or forbid her meals for days, alternating emotional starvation with abrupt, guilt-laden gifts of affection. It was a classic pattern of trauma bonding, cruelty interspersed with unpredictable kindness, eroding Lisa's sense of reality until she could not distinguish between love and fear. At school, Lisa wore long sleeves no matter the weather. When teachers asked about her withdrawn demeanor or the bruises on her arms, she smiled and recited stories Dorothy had carefully scripted. Over time, the adults in her life grew numb to the warning signs. Her truancy became just another statistic. Some classmates speculated about her home life, but few dared to pry. After all, the Miller family had a reputation, and children learned early how to look away from trouble. Around the time Lisa turned 15, things grew worse. The unspoken understanding between Dorothy and Lisa shattered completely one winter night when Dorothy accused her daughter, wildly and with no evidence, of trying to destroy the family from within. What followed was a night of terror, the type that would splinter even the most resilient spirit. Lisa ran again and this time refused to return. She hid in vacant lots, crashed on the floors of indifferent acquaintances surviving on vending machine snacks and pocket change. For several days the city searched, a missing persons bulletin issued but quickly lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of Sacramento's overburdened child welfare system. Eventually, Lisa was found, shaking and half-starved, hiding behind a dumpster on the outskirts of town. The police, feeling pressure from mounting headlines, returned her home once more, but this time, the stakes were higher. Whispers flew about the Miller residence, and the threat of authorities loomed. For a brief period, Dorothy softened her approach, knowing the family was being watched. But vigilance only ever prolonged the agony. It did not erase it. Lisa learned to hide deeper, to grow smaller, until the world stopped asking questions and the pain became her sole companion. By the time she turned 17, her childhood had evaporated. Lisa ceased attending school, cut ties with nearly everyone, and faded anonymously into the gaps between institutions. shelters, group homes, temporary placements, all the while marked as a problem kid, never truly understood as a product of chronic, unrelenting trauma. The spirit of survival that had once helped her flee now morphed into a silent numbness. Mental health evaluations labeled her with generic terms, depression, oppositional disorder, with few recognizing the specifics of the violence that had sculpted her wounds. The system failed Lisa at every turn. Each attempt at intervention was half-hearted, underfunded, and quickly abandoned in favor of newer emergencies. Caseworkers, overloaded and skeptical of her ever-changing stories, chalked her up as another cautionary tale from a family already stamped with tragedy. When she vanished for good, no one knew the truth. She slipped through the cracks, first emotionally, then physically. Her final chapter, marked by an unceremonious Jane Doe in a file buried deep within the state's archives, is remembered only by her youngest siblings, who still whisper her name in the hope that someone, somewhere, will recall the girl lost inside a story too painful to retell. But Lisa's fate was far from an isolated tragedy. It was a blueprint, a recurring nightmare that haunted each of Dorothy's children. Her younger siblings carried the same burdens, though each bore scars in their own way. Some, like Amanda, desperately sought their mother's approval, bending themselves in impossible shapes to avoid her wrath. Others turned to the streets, seeking comfort in dangerous places, perpetuating the familiar cycle of distrust and desperate self-preservation. The cumulative effect was devastating. Even as adults, the surviving Miller children struggled to form stable relationships, shuddered at loud noises, and battled insomnia fueled by memories they could not silence. When tragedy claimed another sibling, it provoked only a muted, exhausted grief, one that no funeral could fully capture. There were no words for the wounds stitched invisibly through their lives, no easy way to account for the damage inflicted in rooms where no one else dared to look. The cycle of violence. When justice is forgotten. Violence, when left unchecked, never simply ends, it evolves, finding new forms and faces, carving scars across generations. For the Miller family, the acquittal of Dorothy for her husband's death was never the quiet conclusion so many hoped it would be. Instead, it marked a new phase in the family's unraveling, one where the lessons of trauma, fear, and unchecked rage played out in ever more devastating ways. Here, beneath faded wallpaper and behind closed doors, the cycle of violence ground on, often hidden from the public gaze, and tragically ignored by the very systems meant to protect those most vulnerable. Amanda, the second daughter, bore silent witness to the family's slow descent. The years following the trial saw the Miller household moving from one apartment to another, each less hospitable than the last. Dorothy's mental health, already fragile, further decayed beneath the weight of stigma and poverty. Her drinking worsened, her paranoia deepened, and the outbursts that had once terrified her children became almost routine, like storms that swept through each week, leaving new destruction in their wake. The children, growing older, each responded in their own desperate way. Some withdrew, internalizing pain in silence, while others acted out, shoplifting, skipping school, or running with dangerous crowds in a bid to find belonging where home offered only volatility. Amanda, ever watchful, tried to hold the remnants of her family together. She helped her younger siblings with homework, cooked simple meals, diffused her mother's rage when possible, and did her best to keep the household functional. And yet, nothing she did was enough to halt the steady slide toward tragedy. Dorothy's paranoia increasingly focused on Amanda. Where once she had cherished her daughter's steadiness, now she saw Amanda's independence and competence as threats. She suspected Amanda of plotting to leave, of talking to the authorities, or of stealing the fragile affection the younger siblings might still show their mother. In moments of clarity, Dorothy wept and apologized, begging Amanda to promise she would never abandon the family, only for her to turn cold and accusatory again days, or sometimes hours, later. The actual events surrounding Amanda's death unfolded in a toxic stew of fear, exhaustion, and deep-seated trauma. There was no grand confrontation, just a slow build of hostility and suspicion, erupting during one especially turbulent winter. The story, eventually pieced together by surviving family members and investigators, was that Amanda, then in her late teens, confronted her mother about the continuing violence. Maybe she threatened to leave, to expose the abuse, or to take her siblings with her. Whatever the spark, the reaction was violent. It's likely that the heated argument quickly spiraled out of control. To the younger siblings, huddled together in their room, the sounds were at first just part of a familiar nightmare. But that night was different. The shouting escalated, punctuated by heavy thuds, and finally, a silence that felt endless. No one would speak for hours. Amanda did not return to the dinner table. Dorothy, pale and trembling, locked herself in the bathroom for much of the following day. The family closed ranks, fear binding them tighter than ever before. As Amelia's absence stretched out, rumors began to circulate. Neighbors, already wary of the commotion at the Miller house, noticed her sudden disappearance. Some whispered about seeing strange men near the home. Others wondered if Amanda had finally run away for good. But the siblings, frightened and loyal, were discouraged by Dorothy from speaking to outsiders. If social workers came calling, Dorothy instructed the children to claim Amanda had moved in with relatives out of state. The truth was both more and less dramatic than rumors could capture. Amanda's body was never given a proper burial. Instead, in a haze of panic, Dorothy enlisted the help of her eldest son, then barely an adult himself, to dispose of the evidence. Under the cover of darkness, the two drove hours east, eventually leaving Amanda's body in a rural area near Reno, Nevada. The silence that followed was suffocating. The children, either not told or sworn to secrecy, internalized this last greatest trauma. The crime became a family secret, a poisonous root sunk deep into their collective memory. For years, Amanda was simply gone. School records were left unresolved, relatives' questions answered with evasions and lies. Dorothy's paranoia now metastasized, becoming more volatile and isolating than ever. She trusted no one and lashed out at anyone who dared challenge her version of reality. The surviving children ceased asking questions, too cowed or traumatized to seek help. And for every family friend, teacher, or neighbor who suspected something was amiss, there were dozens of reasons: apathy, fear, policy, to keep their distance or rationalize the warning signs. The cycle of violence thus widened its reach, ensuring that Amanda's death, like so many other tragedies in homes like the Millers, remained shrouded in secrecy. The justice system, already overwhelmed by poverty and family dysfunction, failed spectacularly. Mandatory reporting systems faltered, investigations were superficial, and the shame that blanketed the family rendered them invisible to the broader community. In this way, violence, committed in private, was protected by the passivity, bureaucracy, and willful ignorance of those on the outside. None of this, of course, was truly hidden from the children inside the house. The lessons they learned were not those of forgiveness or hope, but rather of terror, complicity, and silence as means of survival. The younger siblings, especially the youngest daughter Emily, bore the burden of secret-keeping through their formative years. The violent patterns they'd once hoped would end with John Carter's death instead blossomed anew, flowering in ever more insidious forms: emotional blackmail, threats of abandonment, and a steady erosion of any sense of safety. By the time Amanda's disappearance was finally acknowledged as a crime and not just another family tragedy, it was too late for the intervention to save anyone. Emily, having grown up in the shadow of her siblings' loss and her mother's madness, was the one to break the cycle of secret shame. As a young adult, she contacted a national crime television program, finally putting an end to the decades of silence and partial stories that characterized the Miller legacy. But even her act of courage was not a total vindication. The damage had been done, the suffering endured. What emerged from the surfacing of Amanda's death was shameful, not only for Dorothy and her surviving children, but for an entire system that looked away. The harshest reality is that Amanda's fate did not surprise those who had watched the Millers struggle for so long. This kind of violence does not blossom overnight. It is the fruit of years of neglect, isolation, untreated trauma, and institutional indifference. In the end, justice was too late for Amanda and for many of her siblings, who lived with wounds that would never quite heal. Dorothy's conviction would come years after the fact, but by then, the family had been hollowed out by loss. Amanda's story, and the story of so many like hers, stands as both a warning and a condemnation. Unless cycles of violence are recognized and interrupted early, and unless justice systems see past their own red tape to the realities faced by those they are meant to protect, these tragedies will echo on endlessly into future generations, unveiling the truth, prosecution, and consequences. For years, the story of Dorothy and the Miller children became little more than faded gossip in the neighborhoods of Sacramento. Tragedy had seemingly been folded into the city's memory, a cautionary tale, discussed only in hushed tones or retold through distorted rumor. Dorothy's surviving children carried on, adrift in the world, their trauma largely invisible to anyone outside the family's fractured orbit. Yet truth, no matter how deeply buried, rarely stays entombed forever. For the Millers, resolution would only come with unimaginable courage, and at an extraordinary cost. It was Emily, the youngest daughter, who ultimately broke the silence. Decades after Amanda's disappearance and the family's secret was all but fossilized, Emily found herself at the edge of her own endurance. She had managed, against considerable odds, to construct a semblance of adulthood, low-wage work, a cramped apartment, and numbing routines that crowded out the memories she spent her whole life running from. But quiet isolation could not silence the ghosts. Nightmares jerked her awake, fragmentary recollections of Amanda's final night haunted her, and every missed call from a family member sent her heart racing with dread. The shame of inaction became heavier with each passing year, a burden that neither time nor distance could erase. Watching a rerun of America's Most Wanted late one sleepless night, Emily was seized by a sense of reckoning that refused to abate. She called the show's tip line, hands trembling as she spelled out her family's secret. The truth about Amanda, the web of lies, Dorothy's cruelty, and the many failures, her own included, that had silenced the past for so long. Investigators, initially skeptical, soon found enough cause to launch a full-scale inquiry into cold case records. Each new fact unspooled another. Each corroborating detail eroded more of the myth that had shielded Dorothy and doomed Amanda. It took months of painstaking work. Detectives cross-matched school records, employment logs, social service documents, and hospital visits. They re-questioned neighbors who now, so many years later, remembered the oddities, the sudden disappearance, the shifting explanations, the frightened faces of the younger children. The oldest surviving Miller sibling, racked with guilt and no longer able to sustain the lies, finally broke down in a formal interview. In spare, anguished words, he described the night Amanda died and how Dorothy orchestrated the cover-up. He admitted to his role, not as a murderer, but as a terrified, coerced teenager trapped by loyalty and fear. The evidence was enough. With the body still missing, prosecutors moved ahead with charges of homicide, child endangerment, and ongoing child abuse against Dorothy. The oldest son received a reduced sentence in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, a painful but necessary step for the case to move forward. Dorothy herself had fled California after the family's dissolution, landing in Utah under a different surname. For a time she lived a shadow of her former self, working low-skilled jobs, battling failing health, alienated from all but a handful of acquaintances who knew nothing of her past. When law enforcement finally arrived at her one-bedroom apartment, Dorothy did not run. Her arrest made the evening news, briefly catapulting the long, cold Miller case back into the public spotlight. Former neighbors reacted with a strange blend of shock and resignation. Many remarked that in hindsight, there had always been something off about that family, but nobody wanted to believe how dark the truth truly was. The trial was exhaustive. The prosecution's case hinged on two pillars: the physical evidence of decades of abuse, and the raw, cathartic testimony of the surviving children. They recounted not only the final days of Amanda's life, but the suffocating climate of terror that had ruled their home for years. The sheer emotional weight broke through even the practiced composure of the courtroom. Forensic psychologists and social workers testified about the prolonged impact of intergenerational trauma, the insidious cycles of silence, and the warning signs missed again and again. Most damning of all was the dawning realization shared by jury and observers alike. Yes, Dorothy was a victim in her youth, but the agony she endured never excused what she became to her own children. Defense attorneys, for their part, struggled to evoke sympathy for Dorothy. They pointed to her mental health diagnoses, to the litany of betrayals and losses, the poverty and the relentless social isolation. But this time, the evidence of her own brutality was impossible to sweep aside with platitudes about endurance or generational wounds. The truth demanded reckoning, not rationalization. In the end, Dorothy was convicted on multiple counts: murder, abuse, and conspiracy to conceal a crime. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life prison terms and would die behind bars in the California Women's Correctional System. The sentencing did not inspire celebration. For the surviving Miller children, no punishment issued to their mother could possibly restore what they lost. Neither could it erase their years of complicit silence, or the guilt that continued to swirl like a storm around Amanda's ghost. Emily's act of bravery, her willingness to expose her own family's darkest wound before the world, earned her brief attention in the local press and advocacy groups for child protection, but heroism, in her story, was a lonely and costly path. Even as the system voiced its regrets, Emily herself struggled with the knowledge that she had helped bring justice, only when everything that could be destroyed already had been. After her testimony, she quietly withdrew from public life, her own health failing in her 30s. She died in 2011, her final years marked by loneliness, determination, and an unshakable resolve to break, if only slightly, the pattern that had entombed her family for so long. The Miller case sent ripples beyond its cast. Reforms in California's child welfare protocols, state-mandated reviews of prosecutorial oversights on domestic violence and child abuse cases, and a bitter acknowledgement by all involved agencies that the price of turning away from recurring pain was always far, far too high. For every Amanda, for every Emily, for the hundreds of families who remained silent or endured when they should have been protected, the Miller story remains a warning. Justice, in their case, came late and at an immeasurable cost, but it came thanks to the courage, suffering, and hard-won honesty of one who had once been powerless. The ultimate reckoning was never about seeing Dorothy punished. It was about forcing both family and society to finally see what happens when pain is hidden and when truth is denied. In that searing illumination, perhaps, there was finally the seed of change. Lessons that echo, reflections, unfinished endings, and the price of survival. Looking back at the jagged mosaic of the Miller family's tragedy, I can't help but feel that the answers are as incomplete as the lives left behind. What does it truly mean to survive a nightmare that never really ends? As I sort through the legacy of violence, trauma, and endurance, I find the clearest lessons are also the most painful. That justice is rarely tidy, society's safety nets are riddled with holes, and the deepest scars often linger out of sight, unspoken but ever present. The story's final chapters never bowed to catharsis. When Dorothy was sentenced at last and the true toll of her actions and inactions became public, the world wanted closure. But for those left behind, resolution was elusive. Emily, the youngest, who pierced the silence and finally spoke the family's truth, was lauded briefly as a symbol of courage. Yet even she was marked by the exhaustion of carrying so much for so long. Her death from illness just years after Dorothy's conviction was one more heartbreak, a reminder that the cost of survival is often invisible and cumulative. If I try to draw a straight line through these years, what emerges is not a clean narrative, but a kaleidoscope of choices and failures. One lesson stands stark. Trauma is never just a personal story. It is generational, shape-shifting, and cunning. The pain Dorothy inflicted did not begin or end with her. It was seeded in her own childhood, watered by poverty, fear, and social neglect, and grew into a destructive force that outlasted any single act of violence. For each Miller child, the baggage went beyond bruises. They carried distrust, fragmented identity, and the nagging suspicion that the world would never believe or care about their quiet suffering. The justice system, confronted with such generational wreckage, was forced to reckon with its own blind spots. How many warning signs did officials ignore? How many reports slipped through the cracks because the family was deemed too complicated, too poor, too fractured? In these failings, there's a damning lesson for any system charged with protecting the vulnerable. That bureaucracy, indifference, and the stigma of poverty can be as deadly as any abuser's fists. Yet the Miller tragedy isn't just a story of institutional failure, it is also a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit, even when battered beyond reason. Emily's decision to speak out cost her dearly, but it broke a chain of silence that had choked generations. In her, we see flickers of hope, that cycles can be broken, that compassion among siblings can outlast terror, that truth, even when it comes too late, has a power all its own. Still, this is not the type of story that ends with uplift or redemption. The survivors, scarred by years of fear and secrecy, struggled to build new lives. Some succeeded, carving out cautious families of their own, learning to trust piece by fragile piece. Others were lost to addiction, homelessness, or the invisible wounds that society rarely recognizes. For the Millers, and for countless others mired in similar cycles, healing remains an incomplete project, one that stretches across lifetimes and defies easy resolution. As I sit with the lessons of this family's saga, I am reminded that justice is only as strong as the compassion and vigilance of those who uphold it. That to ignore the pain behind closed doors is to allow more tragedies to fester. That prevention, early, sustained, and rooted in dignity, should always outweigh punishment delivered too late. And perhaps, most crucially, that the stories we choose to face rather than bury are the truest agents of change. No law was ever passed that could return the Miller children their childhoods, or undo the suffering that became their inheritance. But their story offers a final unfinished plea for all of us. See the invisible scars, listen to the unspoken pain, and remember that sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is simply to speak the truth.